Ever since the dawn of time, video game manufacturers have birthed many franchises into the wild. Some with long, prospering, and critical and commercial acclaim, spawning a culmination of sequels and spin-offs and are remembered for generations. Some, however, aren't so fortunate, whether it be due to mismanagement or not meeting desired sales numbers. Some game franchises live for years of success, only to be forgotten overnight, in an instant, losing their status. Legend tells of a day where they will rise once again. Just when that will be, we don't yet know.
That's right, everybody, Halloween is officially upon us, so let's heebie our jeebies and jeep some creeps as we take a look at a few notable dead video game franchises. This is far from the most dead game on this list because Star Fox Zero only came out 5 years ago. 5 years ago? The original Star Fox and Star Fox 64 were some of the most iconic games on their respective systems, thoroughly redefining what it meant to be a fly-through-space and shoot-stuff game, with the franchise spawning a sequel on each Nintendo console to follow, bar skipping out on the Wii, up until its latest release, Star Fox Zero on Wii U. While the series started out strong on the SNES and N64, from then on out, Nintendo just started playing hot potato with it, passing it on to essentially a different studio for every new entry. And of course, that's where quality started to falter a bit. While it received 3 entries throughout the 2000s and a remake of 64 to kick off the 2010s, it was obvious that Nintendo just didn't really care about this franchise as much as they did in the 90s, and thus were willing to throw it at a studio and say do whatever because they would still have Mario as their main moneymaker. And even though it's really only been 5 years since Star Fox Zero released, you can't deny that the series' future is uncertain, if it is even to continue, that is. Speaking of Nintendo stopping caring about some of their franchises past the 90s, F-Zero was a racing game first released in 1990 on the SNES and was one of the earliest uses of the console's Mode 7 graphics. A sequel on the N64 titled F-Zero X would release 8 years later, sacrificing polygon count for a faster gameplay, until a happy compromise was later made in the next entry, F-Zero GX, on GameCube. There were a few Game Boy Advance titles released from then on out, sticking to a similar visual style that the SNES original had, but from 2004 onwards, there was no F-Zero game in sight. Nintendo themselves haven't outright said that there will be no more F-Zero games in the future, but Takaya Imamura, a former designer at Nintendo, has said that it would be hard to bring it back without some big new idea. I know this is 3 franchises in one, but they all sort of fell off at a similar time, so I thought why not group them together? While the whole Toys to Life concept dates back to like the 90s, it really took off in the 2010s with the release of the big 3, Skylanders, Disney Infinity, and LEGO Dimensions. Now, personally, I've dabbled in Skylanders and LEGO Dimensions, but never got around to Disney Infinity, and despite things taking a turn for the worse with these games from 2015 onwards, I have to say that up until then, these games were pretty good fun. I remember the Skylanders series being genuinely fun in its first 3 entries, and LEGO Dimensions was just a really solid LEGO game, and Disney Infinity, well, again, no idea. But in 2015, it was becoming clear that A, the charm was starting to wear off, and B, it was starting to set in that these games were absolutely riddled with consumerism. These franchises got new entries every year for their entire existence, and I think everybody just eventually got sick of it, with all of the big 3 not releasing a new entry for about 5 years now. Disney Infinity was the first to call it a day, seeing its last release in 2015, Skylanders was next to follow in 2016, and LEGO Dimensions ended production in 2017. Releasing in 1998 on the N64, Banjo-Kazooie became something of a collectathon cult classic. Obviously taking notes from the genre-defining 3D platformer that was Super Mario 64, Rareware still managed to create a unique and incredibly fun 3D platformer of their own. It was a critical success in its own right, which then led to the creation of a sequel, Banjo-Tooie, which made use of a bunch of content and levels cut from the original. Banjo-Tooie released on the N64 only a year before the release of Nintendo's next home console, the GameCube, before going pretty silent in the early 2000s. A couple of GBA titles were released to bridge the gap from 2003 to 2008, aka when Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts released. Yeah, not a lot of people really like that game. Microsoft had acquired Rare in the early 2000s and obviously wanted to take the series in a new direction with 2008's Nuts and Bolts. That being having a main gimmick of vehicles, because you know how everyone really likes cars. But from then on out, there's been no sequels to a franchise that I believe really deserves one. Well, everybody, I hope you enjoyed that little bit of a gander through the graveyard of dead video game franchises. Of course, I limited this list to just a handful of franchises that I felt like were the most prolific or whatever, so if you know any dead franchises that I didn't talk about that are worth a mention, feel free to chuck them down in the comments, and oy vey, wouldn't it be quite a disappointment if a bunch of dead franchises came back to attack me 4 years from now? I'm kidding. That's stupid, it would never happen. Anyways, happy Halloween, everybody!